Hey everyone, Francesca here, research collaborator of For the Wild. I wanted to let you guys know that you're about to listen to a damn good episode about beavers. And you might end up thinking to yourself, wow, I wish I could support the work that goes behind these comprehensive interviews. And guess what? I'm here to tell you that you can through our crowdfunding campaign on Drip. You can support the podcast on a monthly basis, and subscriptions start at just $2 a month. So go check out d.rip/for-the-wild. Thanks everyone, and hope you enjoy the episode.
Beavers do it better and they do it cheaper, and we should recognize that they are our partners in restoration rather than our opponents. So let the rodent do the work.
The silence is broken by somebody crying, trying to be heard, never a word. Always the attitude, sort out your own, always alone, wishing for something the world is denying. Out in the wilderness somebody's crying.
Hello and welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today we are speaking with Ben Goldfarb. Ben is an independent environmental journalist based in Spokane, Washington, whose writing has appeared in publications such as Mother Jones, Science, The Guardian, and High Country News. He is the author of Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. Well, Ben, thank you so much for the fervor and intelligence with which you write and speak for our incredibly unrepresented beaver relatives. I'm so excited to spend this next hour diving into the largely unappreciated role of the beaver and their expansive history across the landscapes we have come to know.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for your kind words about the book, and I'm looking forward to it as well.
Oh, great. Well, I would love to begin our conversation in reverence for the beaver as a keystone species. So can you share with us who the North American beaver is and perhaps what fascinates you about beavers and their culture and why you were motivated to take on this endeavor in their defense?
Yeah, that's a great place to begin. So I think I'll just start with my own motivation. I'll start with the last question first. So I've, like many people who spend a lot of time outdoors, hiking and fishing and camping and canoeing, I've always had some appreciation for beavers and respect for their incredible powers of engineering, their amazing ingenuity. But it wasn't really until a few years ago that I became a true beaver believer, a member of the beaver cult. I was living in Seattle and I met a biologist named Kent Woodruff. He worked for the Forest Service. He was then the director of the Methow Beaver Project. And what the Methow Beaver Project does is they live trap quote-unquote nuisance beavers, beavers that are clogging up road culverts or cutting down people's ornamental trees or what have you. And they relocate those beavers to public land, build their dams, store water, create some fantastic wildlife habitat, and really do some good. So it was going with Kent and his Methow Valley Beaver crew to some of the places where they had relocated beavers, seeing these incredible infrastructural complexes and recognizing just how much water these animals were capturing and storing on a pretty dry landscape in central Washington. It was really, incredible to see how the most vibrant habitat and the best water storage sites were the ones that were created by this incredible animal. So I think it was going out there with Kent and his crew, these really gifted interpreters of landscape, that convinced me to see the beaver not only as one cool animal among many cool animals in North American ecosystems, but actually this, again, as you say, a keystone species, this animal really responsible for creating so much life.
Yes, absolutely. Beavers are they are responsible for creating so much life, and most of us have forgotten that we are living in a land that beavers initially created. The pre-colonial landscape of Turtle Island, a time in which there were hundreds of millions of beavers roaming the land, looked vastly different than what we remember. So how did these masters of complexity and stewards of biodiversity engineer our shared ecosystems?
Yeah, as you say, there's no question, we don't totally know what North America looked like before European arrival and beaver trapping began, but there's no question it was just a much lusher, wetter, greener place. You read these accounts of explorers like Lewis and Clark, traversing pre-trapping North American landscapes, and they encountered beaver dams as far as the eye could see in every single tributary of the Missouri River. There are explorers talking about crossing the state of Indiana and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles in part because beavers had so thoroughly ponded up and turned soggy the American Midwest. So it's just, again, it's hard to know exactly what these ecosystems look like, but there's just no question that beavers profoundly transformed them. The initial population estimate for beavers in North America was as many as 400 million animals, creating potentially hundreds of millions of ponds, and also creating just fantastic wildlife habitat. You think about all of the animals who depend on these beaver-built environments. Think about the frogs and salamanders that breed in beaver ponds, and the waterfowl that nest and forage in them, and the moose that cool off in them, and the juvenile salmon and trout that rear in beaver ponds. I don't think that we don't really think about beaver trapping as being this environmental catastrophe on the same level as the deforestation of the Northeast or the busting of the American prairie or, placer mining in the Sierra Nevada. But I think that we should. I think that we should reconceive beaver trapping as this really dramatic, catastrophic form of environmental change that had really dire implications for all kinds of species in North America and Europe as well. There are beavers in Europe, and the destruction of that animal would have been a similar kind of environmental disaster.
Yeah, there was just not any forethought on what decimating this species would do to, like you were saying, wildlife habitat, entire wetland ecosystems. It's really incredible to imagine how much has changed. And in your book, you express that more than any other natural resource, beavers help explain just about every significant American event between European arrival and the Civil War. We should all understand that the economic and geographic expansion of settlers would not have been made feasible without the dissemination of beavers. And along with this ecological loss, there was also a spiritual loss amongst the land and waters and indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. So how are beavers integral to the story of colonization, and how can we begin to understand the multiplicity of colonizations that took place during the period that you call the fur-pocalypse?
Yeah, beavers were really this critical sort of economic resource when colonists first arrived in the New World. To use one example, when the Pilgrims showed up, they owed lots of money to their creditors back in England. The only way they could repay those debts was by shipping beaver furs back across the Atlantic to the people who had bankrolled them. So beavers really made the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony possible. The Louisiana Purchase was in part Jefferson wanting to acquire new lands for beaver trapping. The Revolutionary War, one of the things that sort of angered colonists was the British restricting access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachians. So, beavers were sort of at the center of so many early events and conflicts because they were such an important economic resource. And as you say, again, beavers were also one of the things that brought the first white explorers and traders and trappers into contact with Native Americans. And a lot of the diseases that wiped out Native tribes were spread by European explorers and beaver traders. So it was this really, really significant early industry. And, I think that colonization may have been inevitable without beavers, but there's no question that the fur trade expedited that process of European westward expansion across North America. As this beaver industry reduced beaver populations and also inadvertently decimated native populations, we did lose so much ecological knowledge about the importance of this animal. One example is that the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, because they understood how integral beavers were to creating water sources in the really dry northern plains landscape, they actually had prohibitions against killing beavers and considered beavers a really important spiritual deity. The ethnographer Rosalind Lapierre has written extensively about this, that they basically would not cooperate with the early fur traders who wanted them to acquire pelts. Blackfeet refused to do so because they knew how important these animals were. So there was all of this really incredible ecological knowledge among indigenous peoples about the importance of beavers, and transformed those ecological relationships. A lot of that knowledge was changed or lost to the detriment of everybody.
It's really heartbreaking to recount this time that's really just fed into the extinction crisis that we're facing now. And I think about the fur-pocalypse and the indigenous peoples. You had mentioned some of the relations that they were having, but I'm wondering, how did the fur-pocalypse force indigenous peoples to sever the threads of kinship and subsistence with beavers in order to forge livelihoods based on extraction? Because from reading your book and other research, the indigenous people weren't always able to fight for the beaver.
Yeah. I'm one of many, many people who have written about the ways that the arrival of the fur trade sort of transformed, and not just the fur trade, but the arrival of European colonists, but the fur trade in particular really transformed the relationship of indigenous people with the land from one of subsistence to sort of one of capitalism and extraction. And of course, that was foisted upon them in many ways. As Harold Hickerson has put it, Native people in the Northeast especially basically became, a vast forest proletariat who went out and trapped beavers and other mammals, and returned the furs to white people in exchange for commercial goods. And that really, transformed the relationship of people with the land. It's kind of interesting. It's what I think is really fascinating is the ways in which in the Northeast, where water is relatively abundant and the forests are pretty dense, a lot of Native people were very willing participants in the fur trade. The white traders showed up. They wanted beaver furs. They didn't really know how to trap beavers themselves. They didn't really have much interest in trapping beavers themselves. And they basically dispatched Native people to go do their dirty work for them and return these pelts. And then as the fur trade spread west, as I said earlier, lots of Western tribes where water is much scarcer, those tribes recognized that these beavers were critical to creating watering holes for bison and waterfowl and other animals, refused to participate in the fur trade. And the white people sort of chalked that up to laziness or stubbornness. But of course, that was really a reflection of ecological knowledge. So the reason that, the famous mountain men era began, you had white people like Kit Carson and Jedediah Smith and Peter Skeen Ogden, all of these sort of legendary trappers who you could see in movies like The Revenant. The reason those white people were forced to become trappers was because Western Native people prized beaver for their incredibly integral role in creating water sources. So in a lot of ways, kind of the history of Western expansion was driven by these tribal cultural practices that, again, related to their ecological knowledge of how important beavers are in arid landscapes.
That is really fascinating to understand the history of the westward expansion through the beavers and the relationship shifts between colonizers, settlers, and the indigenous people, and just how that manifested into what we're seeing today. Just to take us back, it was an insatiable colonial thirst for dominance and resources and wealth that originally squandered the beaver population. And I think back to a passage in your book that shares the story of George Simpson and the Hudson Bay Company. And Simpson, worried about American encroachment into the Oregon Territory, implemented a fur desert policy, purposefully leaving no beavers alive in the watersheds they trapped, in a means of deterring American fur trappers who were moving northwest. While reading that account, I couldn't help but think on another statistic you mentioned, that in 2017 alone, Wildlife Services murdered 23,646 beavers, equaling one beaver death every 22 minutes. So while their motives are different, these two anecdotes represent similar histories of dissemination. And I was wondering if you think these stories share any continuous threads.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that the continuous thread is that we still don't fully recognize how important these animals are. The fur desert policy you're talking about, I mean, that was, as you said, it was basically the Hudson's Bay Company, which was sort of this vast British fur monopoly based in Canada, wanted to prevent American settlers from moving to the Northwest because they wanted to claim the Oregon Territory for Britain. At the time, the Oregon Territory was sort of jointly occupied by the British and the Americans. They hadn't quite figured out where to put the border between Canada and the U.S., so they basically trapped out all of the beavers there. And actually, the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada, normally they had a relatively, compared to other fur companies, a kind of relatively progressive attitude about beaver trapping. They were somewhat more sustainable, pregnant females, for example. But in the Oregon Territory, they basically said, let's just kill everything so that the Americans don't have any reason to come up here. They completely wiped out beavers in all of the inland Northwest, which is where I live today. So that was that story. And the Wildlife Services issue you're talking about, I mean, that's the Wildlife Services is basically a branch of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that's sort of tasked with controlling problematic wildlife, coyotes that kill sheep, for example, or starlings that eat farmers' crops. They kill over 20,000 beavers each year. So over the centuries, our relationship toward beavers has sort of shifted. I mean, initially, it was one of sort of capitalism and economic extraction and resource use. Now, the beaver fur trade is sort of on life support. The pelt price is very low. But we still kill lots of beavers as we view them as nuisances. So our motivation for killing them has somewhat shifted. We're still fundamentally antagonistic toward beavers in a lot of respects. And what my book is about is basically saying this animal has always been integral to American history and landscapes and ecology and economies. How can we shift that relationship one more time? We've gone from extraction to antagonism. We go from antagonism to cooperation or partnership. So I think that's the connection there, is that we just don't fully understand how important these animals are for so many environmental reasons, and how can we steward them as sort of partners in ecological restoration rather than treating it as a resource to be extracted or a nuisance to be controlled.
It's really insane to hear these short-sighted strategies implemented by government or settlers, these federal agencies, state agencies, to continue to still kill that many beavers, over 20,000 beavers a year. And the repercussions that we're having with intense droughts and now going into climate change, it's really so frustrating. And honestly, I'm hearing this all over the world. It's nuts. Like the killing of wolves up in Canada. I mean, this is just a massive issue with the killings of wildlife. And rather than seeing a wildlife habitat being actually something valuable and these wildlife performing some ecosystem service, which I actually don't agree with, but I also realize that that's how people need to put it into words for some people to care, is to put it into these ecosystem service roles. It's just really insane. And in the absence of beavers, wetlands have dried up, and rich and diverse meandering streams have eroded, and vital habitats have been just deadened. So I'm wondering what the threats are and the long-term implications are of humans misperceiving nature. And how does the theory of shifting baselines relate to the ecological legacy of colonizers?
That's a really great and complex question. And, actually, what you said about ecosystem services being, not the best framework to think about, I agree with you, that I do think that there's a danger to sort of ascribing value to nature and to wildlife, because, what do you do with the species that doesn't play, a super obvious role in water storage or wetland creation? You're right that it is dangerous. But I think that the agencies that make decisions about wildlife, that's exactly their mentality. They're trying to maximize things like water storage and aquifer recharge and wildlife habitat creation. In the book, I do sort of talk about beavers as a tool almost, which makes me uncomfortable in some ways because I don't want to be too utilitarian, but I also think that that's a really effective strategy for reaching people, especially the people who call the shots. As for the question about shifting baselines, I think that's exactly, what has happened over the course of centuries is sort of this process of ecological amnesia, where each sort of successive generation basically forgets what the environment used to look like. It's sort of like the classic story of today, I go catch a 5-pound fish and I'm really excited, but I don't realize that, my grandfather used to catch 50-pound fish, right? And I think that, that beavers they kind of fit into the same paradigm where, we don't fully appreciate how rich and abundant North American landscapes used to be because, when the trappers decimated beaver populations, there were no ecologists and naturalists to record those processes. So we've just forgotten so much about what our landscapes used to look like or what they should look like. But, at the same time, and I think that the shifting baselines thing works in both directions, right? At the turn of the century in 1900, we were down to something like 100,000 beavers in all of North America, from a population that used to be as high as 400 million. So beavers had just completely collapsed. Now they've actually recovered really well. Now that, nobody quite knows how many beavers are in North America today, but it's probably 15 million or so is the best estimate that I've seen. So, we've gone from 100,000 beavers and them being extirpated in, the entire American Northeast to having 15 million beavers. And, now you can drive down like the Mass Pike in central Massachusetts and see a beaver lodge every 5 minutes. Which I think is pretty cool. So, so we've lost a lot, but, beavers are also one of our great wildlife success stories, really proof for how well conservation can work when we commit to it.
Fair dawn blushes rosy, yielding to the blue. One more resurrection until I reunite with you. We will meet again somewhere around the bend. Yon horizons curve. Whoa, the message that we serve.
One thing you had mentioned is that these federal agencies or state agencies, they are wanting to protect aquifers and keeping resources such as water abundant. So why would they then want to kill beavers? If beavers help with water retention and they support wetlands and ponds, what is their thought process behind killing the beavers to then protect aquifers and wetlands?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the issue is that, a lot of times you just have government agencies working at cross purposes. So like in Wyoming, for example, you've got the federal agency, which is the U.S. Forest Service, that manages a lot of the public land in Wyoming. They're actually doing beaver relocations and reintroductions in some of their forests because they recognize how these animals are for habitat creation. But at the same time, we've got a state agency, the Wyoming Department of Game and Fish, which is permitting the continued trapping of beavers because they depend in part on the revenue from trapping license sales. So you've got a federal agency and a state that are sort of working at cross purposes because they have different motives and objectives. The same deal is true in the Northwest, where you've got the National Marine Fishery Service really promoting the use of beavers as a way to improve salmon habitat because, salmon is a really beaver-dependent fish. And then meanwhile, you've got Wildlife Services, the agency that sort of controls quote-unquote nuisance animals, basically killing beavers because they're clogging up road culverts. So you've got, again, this time two federal agencies who are working at cross purposes because their sort of governing missions are very different. So I think that's why you get these somewhat nonsensical outcomes in a lot of cases, is because you have agencies whose objectives are just completely different, and they're both tasked with managing this species that just crosses so many jurisdictional boundaries.
How does stronger understanding of ecological history, flawed as it may be, combat shifting baseline syndrome?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I think that's exactly it. Is we just have to get out there and experience these landscapes. To me, one of the great things about beavers is that they're just, they're such fun, charismatic animals to watch. It's like, I love seeing wildlife of all shapes and sizes, but there are really few species that you can watch engage in behaviors as complex and interesting as beavers. I was out there a couple of nights ago along the Spokane River, and I watched a beaver, swimming up and down rapids, going to this willow stand, cutting willow, swimming back through the rapids, carrying the willow, depositing it downstream to be used in construction later, coming back upstream. It was really just, this incredible, sort of complex, interesting set of behaviors. So that's just, to me, beavers are just so much fun to watch. And I guess that's that's kind of the antidote to the ecological forgetting that we've experienced. It's just getting out there and seeing these animals, seeing also some of the happiest, beaver memories are, you go to a beaver pond and you don't see the beavers themselves, but you see the frogs that are using the foraging canals that beavers dig. You see kingfishers, fishing for juvenile trout in the pond. You see moose coming down to the pond to drink. You see bear tracks and scat and scratch marks on trees. Because bears love these amazingly abundant habitats. So I think that's kind of the secret, is just getting out there, seeing beavers, and seeing all of the life that these animals support, and recognizing that once upon a time there were so many more of these beaver-created habitats. They were so much more abundant and integral to landscapes.
Relationships between humans and beavers are taking on new forms. Despite the rebound in beaver population, their cultural carrying capacity is still somewhat tumultuous. What are some of the most common interactions or challenges you've witnessed people experiencing with beavers, and how can our listeners be encouraged to respectfully engage with beavers in their bioregion? Are there certain policies that have directly led to the renewal of beaver populations?
Yeah, so you're right that cultural carrying capacity for beavers is in a lot of places pretty low. Scientists talk about the biological carrying capacity being, how many beavers or deer or bears or whatever a given ecosystem can support, right? How much habitat is there? How much food is there? That's sort of the biological carrying capacity. But then you've got the cultural carrying capacity, which is, how many beavers in this case will people support or tolerate? How many can be in the landscape before people, start getting angry about the flooding in their backyard or what have you? And those are very different numbers, right? The biological carrying capacity and the cultural carrying capacity. So I think what a lot of people are trying to do now is to say, well, by solving some of these beaver problems non-lethally without killing the offending beavers, can we raise that cultural carrying capacity? Can we convince more people to tolerate more beavers by solving those problems better, basically? The way that most beaver conflicts are addressed is just trapping out the beavers who cause the problems, which maybe works in the short run, but of course all you're doing is just creating a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as the habitat is there, beavers are always going to be back in there, and you're always going to have the conflict, incur the cost of hiring a trapper, and you'll be killing the beavers. So, I think one really great solution that's promoted as kind of an answer to some of these conflicts is what's called a flow device. And a flow device is basically this sort of pipe and fence system. You pass the pipe through the beaver dam or through the road culvert or whatever, and you basically move water from the upstream side of the beaver pond to the downstream side, and you put little fences around the inflow and outflow of the pipe to prevent beavers from clogging it up. And that way you can basically regulate the height of the pond. So you can say, hey, I like having the beavers here, I appreciate what they do, but I don't want to have to wade through my backyard. You can use one of these flow devices to basically manage that problem while allowing the beavers to remain in place. I think that's the really critical thing, is letting the beavers stay put while also solving the problem. So, places that have implemented those kinds of solutions have really seen not only dramatic environmental benefits, but also dramatic economic benefits, right? Because you're solving the problem. You're not having to trap those beavers every year, and you're avoiding the damage to the road or whatever property you're worried about. So I think that, when you look at in New England, especially in the Northeast, there are a handful of people who are working on these issues, using these flow devices and experiencing really, really great results. So if you're listening at home, I would encourage you to check out a website called the Beaver Institute, which is a nonprofit founded by this guy named Mike Callahan. Mike is one of the world's leaders in flow device installation and non-lethal beaver conflict resolution. This nonprofit, the Beaver Institute, has a really wonderful website with lots of information about how you can go about installing these flow devices, finding somebody, a professional in your area to install them for you, and why they're such a valuable technique. So the Beaver Institute, check that out if you're listening to this podcast.
I went to a community beaver talk, and I remember a woman there who said that she really cared about the environment, but did not want beavers reintroduced because she didn't want the valley part of her land to be flooded. And I think there's a real disconnect between saying that we care about the environment, but only if it doesn't disrupt what we think our lives or what we feel like we're entitled to, really, I think is what it is. I'm thinking about how do present-day beaver reintroductions and conflicts challenge the boundaries of our colonial perceptions of structure, nature, and order? And then also, at what point in time do we see the emergence of cultural carrying capacity with regards to beavers?
Good question. I think you're right that there's this idea, this ancient idea that is just so deeply embedded in human thought and consciousness that, we are godlike, right? I mean, in the Bible, it says that, God granted us dominion over all of the beasts of the earth, right? And I think that mindset even makes its way into the mentalities of environmentalists and people who care for the earth. I mean, you see this all the time at wildlife refuges, for example, they're wildlife refuges. They're places where wildlife should theoretically be safe, yet managers have beavers trapped out of there because they just feel like beaver dam building and pond creation doesn't jibe with the vision for managing this land. There's this idea that at refuges where kind of the primary value is creating waterfowl habitat, it's like, well, we humans know how to breed ducks. We know how to move water around the landscape and create these fantastic duck ponds. Never mind that, that beavers and waterfowl have been inextricably linked for millions of years, that these rodents have been creating fantastic duck ponds. And there's, this amazing wealth of research showing that waterfowl benefits tremendously from beaver presence. Yet, because we as humans think we can do it better, we trap out these animals that could be, that could be creating habitat for us for free. And we do it at wildlife refuges, again, which I think is just so bizarre and ironic and sort of indicative of the way we interact with the natural world. So, a lot of what my book is about, and a lot of what beaver believers, the scientists who are increasingly working with beavers, think about is how can we let the rodent do the work, is sort of the mantra of lots of these engineers now, saying, okay, this animal does this work instinctively, right? It creates ponds, it creates wetlands, it captures sediment, it filters out water pollution, it does all of these really incredibly valuable services for us. And again, it does them for free, and it does them better than we can do them because it's been doing it, it's been doing this instinctively for millions of years. So how can we sort of step back a little bit and rely on these animals to create some of this great habitat without, spending billions of dollars doing it ourselves. And I love that idea of sort of being humble, basically. To me that's the lesson of beaver work more than anything else. Is just humility in the face of this other species that does this work so well. And again, stepping back and facilitating beavers, allowing beavers to do their thing rather than micromanaging them, I think is a really great way of thinking about beaver restoration. But of course, as you said, that's going to require us to rethink what a healthy ecosystem looks like, right? I mean, we're all sort of accustomed to thinking about, the perfect stream that you would see in like the fly fishing magazine, right? Which is, this merry brook trickling over the rocks, that you could like wade right across. And, of course, beavers don't create that kind of landscape, right? I mean, beavers create these broad, sluggish, multi-channel streams that, look more like marshes or swamps or wetlands, and there's dead and dying trees everywhere. And it, kind of smells like decay. It's not exactly like the picture perfect ecosystem, or at least our conception of the picture perfect ecosystem. So, we have to, in some ways, I think, readjust what we think an aquatic ecosystem should look like and include beavers in that conception.
Thank you for that. I think this human supremacist mindset that guides us to say, oh, we are entitled to this type of stream, to this type of look, to this type of smell of the earth, when that isn't, not only is it not natural, it's actually not the most ecologically beneficial to anyone to be getting in the way of these things. And when you mentioned that in the wildlife refuges that beavers are being killed because of management, because of the way that people want to manage an ecosystem, it's really insanity. It's insanity that we think as humans that somehow we have a better idea of how to manage an ecosystem, when looking back at history, time and time again, we realize that most every time we get involved with thinking that we know best, we end up destroying so much. I mean, we wouldn't be in the sixth mass extinction at this point if we weren't doing something wrong. So I just think it's really insanity. And it's interesting to look through the lens of the beaver as this unrepresented creature, this relative who's done so much for us. And yet we are still at war with the beaver culturally. It's really unbelievable to learn about. And gosh, I just wonder, do you foresee a time when beavers will be able to live out their lives autonomously?
That's a good question. Just another sort of crazy way in which we manage beavers that I think gets at your question a little bit is the relationship between beavers and salmon, right? I mean, we know that beavers create this amazing habitat, especially for juvenile salmon, which need these nice slow water ponds and side channels and eddies and pools to shelter in. It's just been shown time and time again that beavers are really integral to salmon production. Yet, there's still lots of beaver trapping, beaver dam removal, basically to facilitate salmon passage, right? The idea is that somehow fish don't know how to get by beaver dams, because, I don't, I guess there's just this forgetting that of course, historically we had hundreds of millions more beavers and millions more salmon as well, and that there's this ancient evolutionary relationship there. Of course, salmon know how to get past beaver dams, and it's been shown time and again that fish actually are very skilled at navigating beaver dams, and most of the time they aren't barriers at all. So it's just kind of another indication of how again we don't recognize these ancient relationships, and we sort of think that, well, what the salmon need is beaver removal, not recognizing that of course these two species are really well linked. And as for whether beavers will ever autonomously live out their lives, I think it depends on where you are. I think there are lots of places now that that have a sort of a more enlightened beaver consciousness, for lack of a better term. Places where these animals are being live trapped and relocated instead of just killed on site, and where we're using flow devices to solve some of these conflicts non-lethally. So I think there's no question that we are making progress on the beaver front, and that there is this amazing sort of groundswell of support for beavers and recognition of how important they are. Again, I think that's still more rule than exception. There's still lots of beaver trapping and destruction. And the overall trend for beavers is certainly good, but it's just very spatially patchy. There are lots of places, again, where these animals are still not really welcomed and embraced on landscapes. So I hope that changes. I hope it continues to change, and I hope that my book can play some small role in facilitating that change.
I have been up in Alaska for the last few months following salmon, the story of salmon and what's happening to the salmon. So I'm happy you brought them up. And I also wanted to say that I've been on so many undammed rivers in the past few months, and the way that a river lives is continuously changing. It's flowing and fluxing and taking down walls and creating new sedimentation and moving a lot of earth with it as it flows and changes its course. And most of the time in the lower 48, we really manage rivers to be so stagnant in a sense, with dams and erosion control and concrete. It's really crazy. Like, that is not how a river has been surviving before industrialization, and then mixing that in with the beavers and the salmon, and then how that honestly affects everything downstream, including the orca, which has been a big topic for people lately with so many orca deaths. So I just really think about all these complex interweavings and how the beaver is a linchpin in this system, and to not acknowledge that is, again, just I want to keep saying insanity, because I feel like that's been a theme word for me in the last few months, listening about the salmon, how we are pushing the salmon to complete collapse, even in places that still, quote unquote, have healthy runs. This is insanity. And I really want to talk more about the salmon and the beaver relationship, because here at For the Wild, we hold our salmon kin incredibly close to our hearts. So I'm wondering if you can share with us how endangered salmon and steelhead runs depend upon the environmental influence of beavers. And how does the proliferation of beaver dams aid in the recovery plan of Chinook, chum, sockeye, and coho salmon, as well as other federally protected fish in places like Oregon?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, as I said before, there's this really closely linked evolutionary history there between beavers and salmon. I mean, think about being a juvenile salmon, right? You're the length of a single finger, and if you're in the main river, in the main channel, you're just going to get blown downstream, right? You're not strong enough yet to really, stay in the main current. So what you need is you need a slow water refuge. You need a deep pool, or a backwater, or side channels especially are really important. And some fish need that more than others. For coho salmon, for example, juvenile coho spend longer in stream than other fish. They migrate to the sea later in life. So for them, it's especially important. They really need that good overwintering habitat, because they're just spending longer in the stream. So they're especially dependent on beavers. And again, I mean, it's just been shown over and over again that this kind of rearing habitat is so important for juvenile salmon. But what's happened, what happened historically when we trapped out beavers is we lost so much of that good habitat. What happens is when you've got a nice, healthy, beaver-rich stream, all of those beaver dams are basically acting as speed bumps, right? They're slowing down water, they're spreading it out, they're pushing water onto the floodplain so that the water can sink into the ground and recharge groundwater tables. And then all of that water basically re-enters the stream downstream, right? I mean, you've got, beavers, they create this great, what scientists call a hypereic exchange, where you've got groundwater and surface water mingling. And that groundwater recharge is really important to keeping water in streams late into the summer and fall. But what happens when you trap out beaver is that you don't have those beaver dams slowing the water down anymore. You've got really rapid erosion. You've got down cutting, as the stream sort of gouges into its bed. And as the stream, cuts further and further down, you lose that connection with the floodplain. You lose that really important sort of water spreading out and soaking into the ground and recharging that groundwater. And the result is streams that actually go dry because they just don't have that groundwater trickling up, bubbling up through the rocks anymore. And those streams basically lose water and you lose fish, of course. I mean, I was on a stream in Western Washington a couple weeks ago. Early in the week, there was water in the stream, and you could see little pockets of juvenile coho. And that was on a Tuesday, I think. And then I came back Friday, 3 days later, and the stream had just completely dried up. There were just little pockets of dead fish in the mud where there had been water a few days earlier, because that stream has just been so degraded, in part because of a lack of beavers that it just couldn't sustain that groundwater recharge anymore. And all of the fish in that stream died, and it lost its value as rearing habitat for juvenile salmon. So, getting beavers back in these streams, creating that complex, slow water habitat that fish need, and facilitating that groundwater recharge and that sort of groundwater surface water exchange that's so important to keeping streams hydrated, in the American West. I mean, that's really critical too. So no question, there's a really strong link between beavers and salmon. There's a very good reason that, that lots of federal agencies now consider beaver restoration an integral step in salmon recovery.
Gosh, that's so sad to hear about the creek drying up. And, a lot of people still think that drought is only affecting California or Colorado or New Mexico. And it's just not the truth. I mean, I've driven from California up to Alaska, and drought is affecting this entire Northwest. I mean, and beyond even these states in British Columbia. So this is a major problem. Creeks are drying up even in places that are the rainiest places on Earth. So I feel like implementing beaver restoration should be mandatory at this point. I mean, we are in many ways in a crisis. We're in a state of emergency with species die off, with collapse of entire fisheries. I mean, this is real. I know I'm speaking to somebody who knows it, but I've just been in it every day for the past, almost 3 months. And I feel like I'm just totally frustrated and outraged. And I just think about beavers, the beaver ponds, they store carbon and excess water runoff, and beaver dams are natural filters for sediments and toxins and agricultural pollutants. So, I mean, they do so much. And, you had talked about, you've mentioned a lot, and I've been trying to visualize as you've talked, but I'm wondering if you could help us visualize a really degraded water system, and a water system that doesn't have beavers. Perhaps it's drying up, perhaps there's been massive erosion. What would be the process of bringing beavers back into that ecosystem? And what would be some of the first changes we'd start to see, after maybe a year or 2 years?
Yeah. So I think the first step is you have to get beavers back there. And that's really challenging because it can be hard for beavers to reestablish in some of these systems, right? I mean, if you've got a stream that's deeply incised, that's down cut and is sort of trapped within its banks and is basically turned into this, this straight fire hose, basically. I mean, that's a really hard place for beavers to establish, right? I mean, their dams get blown out. They can't really build or create nice ponds because you can't spread water onto the floodplain if the stream is trapped deep within its banks. So it can be really hard for beavers to come back into some of these degraded systems. So the first step, I think, is you got to get beavers back in there. One solution that works well in some cases to do that is installing these things called beaver dam analogs, which are basically human-built beaver dams. They're sort of like beaver starter kits, where you pound a few posts into the stream bed, leave a couple willows in there, and that basically gives beavers a more stable starting point that they can build off of. So I think that getting beavers back in there, often through the use of beaver dam analogs, in some cases you can get beavers back in just by changing the land use. In Nevada, for example, in places that were really heavily grazed historically by cattle, where there was no vegetation for beavers to eat, there's been a lot of beaver restoration success just by changing some of the grazing patterns. By reducing some of that grazing pressure, you get streamside willows growing back, and beavers have been able to follow those willows and show up and build and do their thing. So I think that's a really critical part of the process, is just getting the land use right, making sure there's enough vegetation there for them to eat and build off of, and if necessary, using these beaver dam analogs to sort of facilitate or direct their reestablishment. Once they're back in there, one of the cool things about beaver built habitats is how dynamic they are. I mean, there's this fantastic cycle that you go through, right, where beavers show up, they build a dam, they create a nice, big, deep pond. In that first phase, that pond is a really good environment for fish, for lots of waterfowl, and then what happens gradually as sediment sort of filters out in the pond, and the pond begins to fill in. It sort of becomes more of a wetland type environment that's really great for wetland dependent plant species and butterflies. In many cases, we rely on the sedges that grow in beaver ponds. It's great breeding habitat for amphibians. And then gradually, as the pond fills in further or beavers leave the area, that goes from a wetland to more of a lush, wet meadow, which is really great habitat for moose and other ungulates and bears. And, eventually it begins to reforest a little bit, and then the cycle starts again where now the beavers show up again, and maybe the food resource has regrown enough for beavers to reestablish in a site that they had to leave. So I think that's one of the amazing things about these beaver-built habitats is they go through this incredible dynamic cycling where at each phase in the process, they're creating great habitat for a different set of species, from these sort of pond and deep water dependent species to wetland species to wet meadow species back to forest. And I think that cycle is really, really cool and incredible. But of course, to get there, you have to change land management enough to allow the beavers to return.
It's amazing just to hear the domino effect after beavers come back to an area, and just listening to all of the different creatures that can then find forage and home again. And I even think about how nearly half of endangered and threatened species in North America rely upon wetlands. So again, they need the beavers to come back. I really love imagining what can happen if we just support them. And another thing that you'd mentioned of how beavers support us is through climate change mitigation. And I want to hear a little bit more about that. How does that actually work? How do beavers affect climate change?
Yeah. So there's there's these great climate adaptation strategies, right? Especially out here in the West, as the climate warms, more and more of a precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow, right? And what happens when it falls as rain is it just runs off the landscape immediately, and it's basically lost, to productive use, to human use. What's so valuable for us is that snowpack, which gradually melts over the course of the summer and fall and basically keeps streams hydrated throughout the entire year. So, of course, as we lose that snowpack, we're losing that great gradual time release runoff. That's causing really, really big problems, not only for farmers and ranchers, but also for fish and wildlife. So, getting beavers back in some of these systems, storing some of this water, creating some groundwater recharge and keeping these streams hydrated is critically important in a lot of places. And beavers aren't, look, they're not a silver bullet, obviously. They're not going to, solve these drought problems by themselves. But, they are one very valuable tool in the toolbox, and also one really cheap tool in the toolbox. They're this solution we can implement for not a whole lot of money. So that's kind of the adaptation piece. The climate change mitigation piece, is that we know that beavers store huge amounts of carbon in their ponds and wetlands. And we know that wetlands in general are this amazing and vastly underappreciated carbon sink. This site of carbon sequestration, as all of this organic matter just settles out in ponds and wetlands. They're just storing huge amounts of carbon. And what happens when beavers are removed from a site is all of those carbon-rich sediments are exposed to the air, and you basically release a lot of that carbon. And these beaver-built habitats go from being carbon sinks to carbon sources. So that's one of the reasons that it's so critical that we get beavers back in these systems and keep them there, because they're capturing huge amounts of carbon and they're releasing that carbon if they are eliminated from the system and the ponds dry up and all of those sediments are exposed. So beavers have a potentially really significant role to play in carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation if we let them play that role.
Amazing. Well, goodness, I'm so appreciative of the time you've spent and clearly the heart that you've put into this project. So Ben, thank you. And please feel free to close out this conversation in any way you see fit. I've definitely could probably talk for many more hours with you, but this has been such a good place to start and really have our listeners start to understand the complexities of what's happening to these magical beings.
Yeah, I would finish the conversation the same way that my book finishes, which is let the rodent do the work. As I said earlier, we're not going to solve our environmental problems with beavers, but we're going to put a dent in them for sure. And we can only do that by being humble in the face of this really remarkable rodent and letting it do some of the restoration work that we spend so much money attempting to do and do very imperfectly. Beavers do it better and they do it cheaper, and we should recognize that they are our partners in restoration rather than our opponents. So let the rodent do the work.
Thank you for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was by Fountain Sun. Our theme music is Silence Returns by Bo and Like a River from Kate Wolf. I'd like to thank our incredible podcast team, our producer and editor, Andrew Storrs, our writer and research collaborator, Francesca Glassbell, our media director, Molly Lebove, and our music coordinator, Carter Lou McElroy. If you haven't rated us on iTunes, please do so. Also, sign up for our newsletter on our website. And don't forget about contributing to DRIP at d.rip/for-the-wild. All right, thanks so much, and until next time.